Hi everyone, my name is Cyril Filias. I'm the lead program Learning and Development at SAREC. And on behalf of all the SAREC team, I would like to welcome you back to our webinar series, Global Perspective in Career Development, Empowering Your Inclusive Practice Through Indigenous Knowledge and Worldviews, done in partnership with the Career Development Association of New Zealand. Today, I'm delighted to be joined once again by this amazing group of career practitioners who initiated fascinating conversation last week. So they will continue the dialogue today, focusing on how to nurture authentic relationship with Indigenous community. But before starting, I want to acknowledge the land where I'm sitting right now, and I want to pay respect to the original stewards and caretaker of these lands. So I'm coming to you from Toronto, and I physically sit on the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga Anishinaabe of New Credit. And I invite you to consider the Indigenous connection to the land where you're sitting right now. And as we will be talking about allyship in our session today, I would like to share a resource that I found particularly interesting, which is the Indigenous Ally Toolkit done by the Montreal Indigenous Community Network and created in 2019 to foster alliances and educate non-Indigenous people and groups on how they can use their privilege to listen, shift power dynamics, and take concrete step toward reconciliation. So I will post this link to the chat shortly for you to access as well. Now, as today is our last webinar of this series, I would like to remind everyone that we will have a short survey toward the end of the session. So I will just invite you to stay with us a few more extra minutes so that you can share your feedback of the series and let us know what other learning need you may have and that we can potentially address. But for now, just quickly a reminder that you can interact with our group of panelists and ask your question or share comment at any time by using the question function that you see on your screen. So we'll have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the webinar where our presenter will welcome your question. And note that we will send you the recording of today's webinar within the 24 hours. And finally, just a reminder that we extended the webinar by 15 minutes today to allow for more conversation and exchange. So with all that, let's not wait any longer to have our panelists start their engaging discussion. So over to you, Victoria.
Thank you. So my name is Victoria Grant, and I'll be the moderator for the conversation today. And the panelists are all going to introduce themselves. And we're going to, for those who want more information on these panelists, there's a more in-depth introduction they did at the beginning of webinar, which is webinar 1, which is available to you. Today, we're going to talk about nurturing authentic relationships with Indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples and their communities is what I like to refer to. So I'm going to ask Lynette to introduce herself.
Atamari e whānau, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Ko poke hapoko te maunga, ko wāmuko te awa, ko ngāti kanohi te iwi, ko Lynette Reid aho. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Welcome to the second and final webinar series. My name is Lynette, and I look forward to more kōrero with all of you today. Kia ora.
And I'm going to ask Trina to go next.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Ani Buju, my name is Trina Maher, president of Bridging Concepts and a First Nations career practitioner here in Canada. And I just look forward to the conversation today and offering some more advice, stories, and experience to share with you all. Thanks.
Peter.
Alofa malo lavas tofu mau in Langimama. My name's Peter. I'm a career practitioner operating out of Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland, and I'm also a academic facilitator. Yeah, great to be here to finish off the conversation from last week. Thank you, Victoria.
So last week we had a conversation, mostly was involved how Lynette, how Peter, and how Trina do their practice. and advice on how they do their work. Today, actually, we're going to have a conversation about reciprocity and interconnectedness on relationship building. We're going to talk about supporting Indigenous voices and self-advocacy and responsible dialogue and inclusive practices. I want to talk first, I guess what I'll begin with, I want to begin with the first question and the question about reciprocity and interconnectedness with Indigenous worldviews, and how that influences your work on a daily basis, Trina.
Well, thank you, Victoria, for the question. And as I was thinking about this in my work, it often comes to me in terms of I cannot ask a client or a practitioner, because I work with other practitioners. I cannot ask them to do something that I myself have not done or am not ready to do. I think that's what it comes down to in terms of my way of understanding Indigenous reciprocity and the way I've been taught from my mom and my community. And so what I mean by that is I do a lot of train the trainer, for example, or I work with youth groups. And if I'm going to take them through a particular exercise on self-reflection, for example, thinking about what their gifts are and how they may reflect on challenges that they may have had in their journey and how they're going to think about what the opportunities are and what the lessons learned are. In the act of reciprocity, I first have to spend time with myself and my own story, exploring that, doing my own reflection, being humble and honest with myself, because if I'm going to ask someone else to tell me their story, to unpack, to reflect, I must first have done it. So it creates that reciprocity of relationship and sharing and builds trust between myself and the people I'm working with. So that's usually how I go about doing it. And I think that would be one of the most important things in terms of building that relationship with whether you're an Indigenous or non-Indigenous practitioner working with Indigenous people, clients, and community is get comfortable with your own story and find ways of bringing that into the work that you do. So I'll pause there and let my co-panelists share their thoughts.
Yeah, I suppose I should share the same viewpoint when you're entering a conversation, that it's not, the power dynamics is not me having that conversation and asking you for the feedback. We, as a Samoan or as a Pacific Indigenous viewpoint, we use the term self-advocacy. So it's looking after the relationship between myself and the individual. And just like you were saying, it's an equal interaction of sharing a mutual understanding around a collective effort. It's not based around individualism, but it's based around the collective thought of bringing and understanding that both have shared into that process.
Yeah, I support my colleagues as well. And the term that comes to mind for me is the space between us. So we're bringing that space together and revealing ourselves to each other. So we're being vulnerable together. We're sharing our knowledge. We're sharing our whakapapa. We're sharing our stories. But that space between us can be quite volatile. It can be energetic. It can be quiet. It can be calm. I think reciprocity is about giving and going with things. Just letting things flow.
So then, if you think about reciprocity in the ways that you described, how have you yourselves, or what advice would you give when keeping in mind how you described reciprocity in supporting Indigenous voices? Because if you're not Indigenous, how do you and you have a client who happens to be Indigenous, what advice would you give them in the space of in this space?
I would suggest, here in Canada, we just did an interesting pilot project of training some foundational career concepts to Indigenous practitioners. And with my experience and this question, this topic did come up. And when we talk about reciprocity, I think it's about being present. It's about being fully in the moment as a practitioner, so that you're not, you have to be community and individual and heart focused, not process oriented, for the reciprocity to work. You have to be really mindful, I think, and in the moment, and really listen to whatever your client or the group that you're working with, wherever they want to go, as you said, with that ebb and flow. Because then I think it comes more, you have a more authentic experience, and you can work with the group, and you become part of the group and part of that community that you're creating, whether you're working one-on-one with an individual or as facilitator to a small group. So I think that would be my advice would definitely be really mindful and be in the moment and present, and be willing to go wherever the conversation's going to take you. Because then your authenticity comes about, and that's all about relationship building there in the moment.
It goes to your point, Trina, when you do enter that conversation, and I like what you had said at the beginning, your first comment around really knowing who thyself is. You really do need to understand what your standpoint is and what is your positioning in terms of having these conversations with Indigenous folk. And we talked about it last week. It's about knowing thyself before coming into a conversation to build, I suppose, what you were talking about, Trina, if I could shape it up as like allyship, building trust that you're there as an ally. And it should be for anyone that you deal with, let alone Indigenous, but Indigenous tend to have those values of family, faith, and culture really embedded into their ways of being. But that also comes from an understanding of where you are from in terms of who you are in the conversation. Just to add on to what your point was.
I think just to extend on what Peter has described, it's also about knowing who you are in career development, and knowing career development and your perspective of career development in relation to Indigenous communities and people. So I think that's paramount as well. Clients are coming to us usually to question, to discover, to explore career and whatever that is. So that, that's your expertise. So stay in that, live within that, be your authentic self in that. And I think also be mindful that, culture, indigeneity is so personal. And it's not something you can be an expert in. You've got to sort of go through it, understand it with the person that you're dealing with. But I think use that career development knowledge, your skills, your values in that space. Don't forget that.
Very good. So if do you have specific strategies what are some specific things you would advise to career advisors and people who are working in this relationship? What when they're like, what are some specific? We talk about reciprocity, we talk about relationship, but are there, how can they come I guess what I would say is there things that they should be first aware of, and when they're working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples?
Yeah,
I
think it goes to you know what Peter was mentioning. It's you have to know yourself, and you have to know your story. And it's similar to how we started off webinar number 1. Practically, I do something like that with every workshop or place I go. It's creating that visual. If I have the opportunity to use something like a PowerPoint slide, and I put personal photos of this, because as Indigenous people, it's very common for us to ask each other the question, where are you from? And where you're from, you know, it's much more than the city you live in. And the company you work for. It's who's your family? What's your story? How did you get from when you were a little person interested, you know, if we talk about career, to understand the world of work to the place that you're in now? That's what that question, where are you from, in the broader sense. And so practically, I would say, you know, find those points in your story that helped you as a practitioner get to this place, and share that with the group that you're working with. And I think as well, let's you know, be honest, our peoples have gone through lots of traumas and challenges, but they've had such resilience that I think we as practitioners, to build that relationship with Indigenous, you know, I do a lot of work with youth groups, and if I'm not honest with them, they know it, you know. So I have to look back to when I was a youth, and what were some of the challenges that I had to overcome to get to this part of my career. And I find ways of shaping that into the story. And that way we can connect as people, because your clients, no matter what age they are, they need to see you as a person, as a human who has gone through the ups and downs, and that maybe it'll give them some hope. And I think that's a big role in what we do as career practitioners is we're hope builders, you know. And so I'll pause there. I think practically it's finding ways of sharing your story at the beginning.
Yeah, it would be the same. It's in I think that's the cultural element of opening up a career conversation with for me it's specific clients. We would open up around who are you, where you're from, and it would be what village are you from, what family are you from. That's not to say that you do that as a non-Indigenous practitioner, but it is asking you, the form of reciprocity is about sharing your story together. And then from that, you're building trust. I now know you, you now know me, it then becomes layered. And it's that trust with each other that you start to then allow them. I think I spoke about this Māori term last week around ahurutanga. We're starting to create safe spaces to have those authentic, deep, real conversations, that it's not superficial. This is based on aspirations that are based on whatever the story or whatever the narrative comes out of it. But it is built around knowing your identity and also then allowing to share that identity with you. And it's a privilege. I think I called it a gift the last week that we had a conversation when an individual shares their whakapapa or their background or their story. It's also a gift that's been given to you. So you would reciprocate that gift by then also gifting back to them your background. It's an indirect way to ask the question, so what's your dream about, what you want to do, what's your aspirations? But it is connected to family. It's connected to some sort of cultural nuances and norms that make that person make the decision. Yeah, there's an addition to Trina.
I think for me, I'm thinking very, very pragmatically, and I'm thinking about the start of a session, and where you're nervous, you know, we're nervous, the client's nervous, you're nervous. Well, I am. So I think about just trying to sort of calm, you know, just be calm, just be in the moment, present. So I guess I'm talking here about pace. Just take your time. I mean, if only we could take our time. Sometimes we are bound by certain periods of time that we can spend with clients, but just think about the pace. And I always think about listening really, really hard, particularly in those early seconds, because I think people, clients, including ourselves, we say things that, until we figure out what's needed here or what's expected here, we say our most vulnerable thoughts in those early stages. So if you can listen to that and grab a hold of it, hold on to it until later into a session and then reflect it back, my gosh, that's where the miracles happen, really. That's where the energy is. So pace, listen, reflect, seek meaning, be intuitive, use that to guide you with all clients, particularly with Māori clients, because our intuition, our wairua, our spirituality is there to guide us, and it's part of the person that's in front of us as well. So it's part of their wairua too that we're sensing. So keep that in mind. But as I say, I think you have to warm into that, and I think that early pacing and listening and just calming yourself down is probably my best advice at this point.
If you had to say, if you had to think about pitfalls, things that become real challenges for you in this and in your own practice, but also what advice would you give a non-Indigenous person in being careful about, or what are some of the challenges that they might come up against in your work? Because I'm sure there are. I mean,
well, I'm going to be frank, Victoria. I think for me, there are times where I have made an assumption based on what the general knowledge is. And so what I'm saying there is, I don't voice it out aloud, but it's the biases that actually show up within me that triggers me, then to sit back and really think about what those are triggering with me, and then search or source help from colleagues or supervision around dealing with, because it is, I would imagine it will be treacherous ground sometimes for a non-Pacific person to have a conversation with Pacific if they haven't actually worked within that environment. So yeah, for me, it's my biases that I think pop up that I deal with straight away, or have real good authentic conversations with oneself as to why they've arisen. And I mentioned it last week too as well, around biases, is to be aware of those biases that one may hold whilst going into those conversations.
Well, for me and building off of that, I think it's a couple of things, working with different groups across this country, in Canada, and a little bit down in the States. I think part of the challenge, even as an Indigenous practitioner who has some experience working with Indigenous communities, it's building off of what Peter said, is, I can't assume I know everything about a community if I'm just working with them for the first time. And we have such a diverse community. Each community has its own history, story, ways of doing things, culture, protocols, language, norms, traumas. And so I think as a practitioner, a practical, I think I see Lynette, practical advice is, when possible, I try to connect with whoever's bringing me into that community, whether it's, the contact, and I get to know that person and build a relationship with that person so that they can inform me and kind of give me some of the background and tell me about, what might be going on with the group before I get there, or if there's recently been some changes with the group that I'm going to be working with. so that I can be informed and I can hold space for the ebb and flow that may need to happen in that workshop. Because I think once you start, and I do more community workshops. So once you're there and you start, you really, I think, as a practitioner, have to be able to switch it up very quickly, listen, and if the group needs to go in a different direction, have your toolbox ready and go to that direction, because that's respect and continues to build that relationship. I think that the pitfalls are that assumption that every community is going to be the same, that every workshop will be delivered the same way, whether there be a formal opening or not, or cultural protocols. And I think that's what's so important, to let the community lead and guide you. Let them tell you what their norm is, or for that particular session or interaction, let that individual or the group ask them what they want. Ask them how they prefer to do things, because I think that's just being respectful. And again, for so long, I think Indigenous communities haven't had the opportunity to lead ourselves and to let others know what we want, to be self-determined in this way. And so the more opportunity we as practitioners can ask instead of tell, I think that goes a long way. So
I don't think there's much more I can add to what my colleagues have said, Victoria. I can only say that when we work together, when we're working together, whether it be Indigenous practitioners with non-Indigenous practitioners and clients and so on, please don't use the opportunity as a display of your cultural competency, because that can sometimes come across as either patronizing or hurtful, or feel, people are sort of taken aback by it. So I'm thinking very much with what Trina has said. Ask, read the signs, the signals from your client, how they're referring to themselves. Not everyone likes to be asked, where are you from? So there are just some sort of generic things that have become a little bit too generic. So be led by who you're working with at that time. And of course, beyond that, beyond a session or whatever it is we're running, it's about what you're doing outside of those times, and the knowledge that you're gleaning from different places, from different courses, from different opportunities to find out about Māori in particular. So there's a lot of work behind the scenes too. I think focus on those to minimize pitfalls.
That was a great comment, Lynette. Where you talked about being careful about what you assume you know. I think that's really important. I think sometimes we can get ourselves into a place where we think we know, and even as Indigenous people with other Indigenous people, never mind the non-Indigenous people, we can do that with each other, because we assume that we've all walked that same path, but we haven't, and our paths are different every day. So when I think of, I guess one of the things I'm asking about then is, we've talked about reciprocity, we've talked about supporting voices, and it's almost like, because one of the things I would ask you is, what is the story you would share that demonstrates, or that would help demonstrate to some of the people who are online, how you interact with your clients, your Indigenous clients, and what I guess from a space where, I'm just trying to think how you say, I guess I'm going to use an example. So there are many of our practitioners who want to add Indigenous ways of knowing and being, but the word Indigenous has become a noun when it is effectively not a noun. It is a description of, you can have an Indigenous plant, you can have an Indigenous person, but so what I'm saying is when I'm talking to people in other places and they talk about, are you Indigenous? If I'm being funny, I say, to what? If I'm being serious, I want to teach, and it depends sometimes on the mood and who's asking. I would say, I'm Timiagama Anishinaabe, one of Canada's many Indigenous peoples across this country, because I'm very careful to say across this country is, we're not of Canada, we're not in Canada, like we are not Canada's Indigenous peoples. So it's those kinds of things. How do you handle those kinds of things? Do you see that kind of thing in your practices? So when people want to add policy to their work, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and that kind of stuff, I guess what I'm asking is, how do you handle those kinds of things? What would you recommend? It's that words, Peter, you and I had this conversation about words. What do words mean when we're having this kind of conversation in career development?
That's a good question, Victoria. And I think there's no one solution. And I think for myself, in hearing what you're saying, sometimes I meet different program folks who, like, from where my teaching comes from, we have the medicine wheel. So we always think in mind, body, spirit, emotion. And so when I'm thinking about how do I do a solution, or how do I talk about career, that's just the way I've been taught, is how does it affect in the medicine wheel and then the circle and cycle. But for other people who are in different parts of this country, different Indigenous groups, it's not the same. That's not their teaching. That's not their way. So I think the practical challenge is, and now it's coming to me, is that I often get the question, what's the one thing I need to do as a non-Indigenous practitioner, or some program who wants to work with Indigenous people? They always want, what's that one thing? What's that one thing I can apply for everyone? And when I say you can't, because, Dene are different from Ojibwe, that are different from Métis and Inuit. And so each community has different ways of doing things. And I think that's what we're trying to say, is the approaches have to be different. And I remember a story. I was working with a particular industry council, and we were looking at labor market, and I was helping do some study about where the potential could go. And it came down to this conversation about relationship building and outreaching with youth and employment and training organizations here in Canada. And when we presented the study to the final working group, that was the question that came up, was, well, what's the one thing we need to do? And then when we said, well, it's very diverse, you have to approach and create different relationships. You have to tweak the program based on where you're going to deliver it. And the immediate feedback was, well, that's too hard. We just want to do it once, and we want one model for everybody. And I think often then that's where things stop, unfortunately. And I think it comes back to what we've all been talking about from webinar number 1, is really respecting that there's different approaches, different aspects of Indigenous worldview. Because even when we say that, and we've had these questions, each of us has a different undertaking because we've all been raised with different teachings, different experiences. So we can only bring our own thoughts and experiences to whatever the situation is, as does most practitioners. And so anyway, I'll pause there because this could be a long conversation, but I think the answer is that there's no one answer to that, and it's about respecting the different diversities and getting used to working within that complexity.
I agree. Wow, what a massive question, Victoria. And it's a great question, and it should be one we should always be asking all the time, not just in webinar series like this, but every day. And I love what you're saying, Trina, because to me the biggest message is that we are different, and we want to be different because we are. So you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's as I said earlier, it's about that space between the cultural differences. You know, that's where the magic happens, where we come together, we collaborate, we cultivate, whatever you want to call it, and new learnings come out of that, new ways of doing things and new models and approaches come out of that. But you could be with somebody else in another time, and that is, the space is different again. And I guess I'm thinking here about my research, and I've spoken with a lot of Māori across Aotearoa, and there are many Māori experiences, many different ways that we express our Māoriness. And through that, the special, unique feature is being Māori, and just that, what that means. It never ceases to amaze me how central that is to everything that we do, everything that we are. And we're trying to understand who we are in this world, how we live in two worlds in Aotearoa, biculturalism, multiculturalism. So yeah, let's just keep dialoguing. Let's just keep talking. Let's have more like this.
There's nothing I can add to that, or to both Lynette and Trina. It's sort of a dichotomy, isn't it? So that we're giving it a definition from Indigenous, which says there's a framework that we have to follow, or assuming that there is some sort of platform to follow, enabling to have a conversation. But what I hear from Lynette and Trina, that's where the gift is the diversity within Indigenous or within those particular cultures. And I think that's with any culture that you deal with, is that where Trina had used the word being present, where Eckhart Tolle talks about being present. And so when you're present at that time, the story is going to be different. The narrative is going to be different because we're all unique and diverse. But in the sense of Indigenous, you'll be able as a practitioner to start to unwrap the lens that an Indigenous experience worldview is, that would actually help enrich you too as well. So that when you go into your next conversation with other Indigenous folk, they will give you another lens because it's so multi-layered. But like Lynette is saying, the diversity in it is a thrill. And I think that's why we're in the game of career practitioners. We are vessels for others to find their greatness. And so we get the opportunity to sit with individuals, to have that conversation. And in this context, it's around a cultural worldview and how they see the world. But it also, I think, when each Indigenous person has an historical story that's behind it, with all that trauma too as well. It's an option there to go there and explore it and answer questions that you may have in terms of what those historical stories are. whilst having that conversation, that reciprocity of what their aspirations are. Those are added gifts that come along with the conversation. For me as a Samoan, it's more of a Tongan, because it's more of a Tongan terminology, Talanoa. It's a Pacific research methodology. And when one goes out to explore or find friends, so Talanoa is having that conversation, but sometimes about nothing, but it emerges when you just keep going with the conversation, or what Trina was saying, Lynette was saying, it's led by spirit or wairuatanga. That's specifically a term you probably use with Indigenous people, that we are led by spirit, whatever that spirit may be. Yeah. I'll stop, because I'll probably go on and on and on. But I'm adding value to what Lynette and Trina have said.
That was wonderful. I'm going to take one of the questions I'm going to read a question, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on it. I really like Prier's approach to relationship building with knowing and the understanding the story behind your genealogy. As we move to a more and more divisive world, this seems as a way to create a bridge of understanding amongst all peoples. Where can people start to understand their own genealogical story?
I'm having a bit of a look at myself, and I think, when did I become a genealogist? I think it really is. It's from an Indigenous practice. As a Samoan, when you wanted to find your genealogy, you go to your family, or find connections and have those conversations and start building those stories around why you do the things that you do, and find similarities, and that adds the narrative to you when you have your conversation with Indigenous folk, that you come with a story. I don't know how to answer that question other than to start having conversations with we in Samoa call it si'omanga, which is your circles. Brofenbrenner talks about it. What is your circle of influence, your circle of where you operate from? Start searching there. Yes.
There is a teaching, and that you are the sum of the people that you've walked with, is a teaching that I grew up with. And I when I think of that, Tom Keene says it best. He says stories, that that's who you are, is your story. And I think I don't know if it's certainly, I think most Indigenous peoples around the world live in their stories.
My Angela has that great comment. I think I might have mentioned it last week. It's a common a quote that she has: "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000." When I first heard that, that really resonated deeply for me as an Indigenous person, that I know that when I do operate in this world, it's because of the many that stand behind me and enrich me and teach me my ways of being. So when you are having conversations with Indigenous folk, know that they come as one, but they stand as 10,000. And it's our role to understand what that is.
Even more so.
I think too, we understand our genealogical story by places. So, we go back to where we were born, where our parents were born. So place is quite significant as well. And people or whānau or family, that's broad, that's huge. So it's cousins, it's aunties, it's uncles, it's the whole village, it's the whole hapu. So there's a huge number of people, and there's wonderful, magnificent places where our whānau are from that you can also go to, visit, take in the wairua there. So that would be just a couple of extra things in support of what Peter said.
Yeah, I think to build off of what Peter and Lynette have mentioned, it's, my mom you know, I'll be doing something, you know, different times of my life, and she'll say, oh, you're doing that just like your grandfather. Or, oh, I see, you know, you're doing that just like your grandma would have, you know, and that becomes part of the story. And then, you know, you learn the traits that have been passed down, because we do have that blood memory. And sometimes it's, for me anyway, it's been talking with my mom and others that, you know, are in my circle, to say, you know, sometimes I'm thinking about this, or I responded to this in a certain way. Where do you think that comes from? And then they'll share a story of someone who had that value, or who had a similar challenge, and that becomes, for me, part of learning about who I am. And it is visiting the place, you know, we've gone back to the reserve a few times, and I think then you add to the story, because when you visit those places, even if you don't live or have the opportunity to visit there often, when you are in those spaces, it's recognizing what comes up for you. What feelings do you connect with yourself now? Because you're part of building now the story going forward. And I think too, it becomes, we have that teaching of 7 generations. So I look back from, you know, I'm kind of like halfway through. I look back at my mom and my grandparents and my great grandparents. And then I look forward to my nephew, his son, and what's my role now in that story as someone who has learned from the past, and I have a responsibility for the future. What are the teachings I'm going to, you know, share with them? And that also becomes part of understanding my story and my place, and how I relate to other things. It's, I think, through our lineage, our legacy that has come before, whether it's, you know, the challenges and the high points, it's how are you going to carry that forward? How are you going to write the next bit of that story? Because you have a responsibility, I think, is something that is one of our teachings. We have a responsibility to acknowledge the good work that others that have come before us have contributed to get us to this point. And we have to carry it forward in whichever way that we're gifted when we talk about career. And some of us are career practitioners sitting around this virtual circle as a way of doing that. So that's how I connect to that question.
This is a really interesting question. I think the next one is she says, can anyone comment on how to do some career building tasks which may be on the land?
What was the question again, Victoria?
Can anyone comment on how to do some career building tasks, activities, which may be on the land? So I think she's asking, what are, if, you know, I guess what I would say, Peter, in Canada, there's this idea of going back to the land. And I think what she's asking is, how do you bring career into that?
I'm going to ask you to answer that question because I don't have the certain norms or social nuances in terms of the word land. Yeah, I might answer it. It might be different, but I will build off yours.
Oh, okay. Well, here in my experience, one specific story comes to mind with a program here that works with youth, that teaches them about careers in mining and minerals and geology. And so we do a lot of in that program exploring career by going out on the land and attaching, you know, teachings and knowledge to practical ways of caring for the environment, for example. In some other programs I've seen where youth may go through a program where they learn about tanning hide, or they may learn about canoe building. And I think in my perspective, it's showing the youth that while they're doing those tasks to prepare the hide, or to create the canoe, and to go on navigate a trip, those are real jobs in the world of work. And I think it's helping people connect what their traditional roles have been in their community to contemporary skills, and awareness about the world of work, and helping people to understand, I think, and value that our communities, I said it, I think, in the first session, our communities would not have functioned and survived all these thousands of years if everyone in the community did not have a job and a role to play. And I think we've just forgotten that. And so I think when I think about this question and career building tasks, I think it's about reminding people and taking them out on the land to show them that, whether you're developing these different tasks, doing these different kind of land-based activities, it's a type of work. There's a role, there's a specialty, there's a skill that you learn and apply. And sometimes it could be team building if you're working with different folks. It can be, the hands-on skills that you're learning. It's the knowledge that you bring from your understanding of caring for environment to the task. So for me, that's where I would go. That's where I go with that, understanding that question, and helping folks to explore that. Because you could certainly build off of that and say, well, what other types of work and roles out there in the broader sense of the work world have these similar tasks or require these similar skill sets, and then help people link to those things. They might want to explore those things a little more.
That's what you're talking about, transferable skills.
Yeah.
Because it's a worldview lens, isn't it? An Indigenous lens. It's not about work, so to speak, in terms of getting a paid job. It's about adding value to the community as a whole. But if we were to look at from a paid job, because careers can also be a voluntary work. There's a high number of Pacific and Māori that work within their communities and are not paid for, but it's part of building the community. Just adding value to that.
I think my thoughts were when I heard the question, is I thought about the notion of career, and just what that means, and that means lots of different things to many of us, and the idea of on the land. When I thought about on the land, I thought about going home, going back to where my whānau are, and I wondered about the experiences when that happens for me. And I don't equate it to career building, but I know it's some type of building. It's building wairua, building your sense of who you are, building, a deeper understanding about this place, about this land that my whānau are from. So I guess I was looking at it from that kind of perspective. Talking to people there, elders, kaumatua, queer, as far as a career building task type of career building. It doesn't feel like it's career building, but, talking to whānau, I guess I'm still thinking about this genealogical story, because I think that's really a lot bigger than, it's big, it's massive, that genealogical story. So I think I'm still stuck in that a little bit, but that was my understanding. That's why I unpacked that question. Yeah,
Funny how we all got different views of what that is. We initially thought, well, how do you run workshops on the land? And my automatic impression of my head was, we'll go to the people of the land and have conversations, build relationships, in order to have authentic conversations on the land. I literally took it as that. Yeah. But it was great to see our different viewpoints on it.
So thank you very much. That was very good. I really enjoyed that. Historically, colonization has systematically excluded Indigenous communities from the economy, and have had their traditional economic activities curtailed. What role does career development play in helping Indigenous peoples regain traditional economies which better reflect the values and aspirations of individuals and communities? That's a tough question in the sense that
it's a huge question.
It's a huge question because tradition, sometimes people assume tradition means you're going back to doing things the same way. But tradition can also mean this is what the intention was, and we need to change as a result of how we change. Right? If every time you go into a room, you meet somebody different, and that affects how you change, it's a tough question. So, what is a traditional economy?
Yeah, it's very
tradition. Yeah,
I think it's really layered. You've got a colonial issue to deal with, and the impacts of racial institutions and how Indigenous people operate within those environments. It's really, really layered. But it's not that I'm ignoring the topic, but when it comes to those sort of massive conversations, mine is really, I go back to what Trina was saying about take it back to the individual that you're talking with, about being an ally with that particular individual and chipping away at getting them to their best and adding value to their own community. Because the question was huge for me to hear. Automatically, my ears shut off when that question came through, because it is quite traumatic to actually talk about some of that stuff. So I tend to just go straight to what's present in front of me and having conversations, knowing that the conversation I'm having with a specific person is I'm adding value to their lives and to their addition to the communities that they work with. There's policies and all that sort of stuff that we're speaking about here. I'm rambling.
I agree. I think go ahead. Go ahead, Lynette.
My first thought was, I heard career development, and I think we have to have a critical understanding of how colonisation is being reproduced in career development. I think that's what we need to understand first and foremost. You know, are we still employing colonised stereotypes and assumptions and ways of doing things, ways of practicing, and so on? So I would like to, you know, be involved in those kind of critical conversations and critical understandings as a precursor to that question. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with both Lynette and Peter. I think it's in this country and some of the conversations, I think it is understanding. I'm not sure a lot of practitioners, as we're saying, have good understanding or enough information has been shared, because we haven't. This is great that we're having these conversations, but to understand how colonization and policies have restricted economic development in our communities for so long. You know, it's not that people didn't want to work, it's that they weren't allowed to leave their community to go to work in some examples. It's not that when we think about economic development and First Nations, you know, benefiting from the resources on their traditional territories and starting businesses, well, we weren't allowed to do those things in history. It was against the law. So we need to look at those, you know, big flashpoints of history and how it's been unpacked, how communities have been resilient. And I think nowadays, thinking about that larger part of the question, you know, around the role that career development can take, I think it's, many communities are starting to have their own self-determination in terms of what economy or work they want to start in their community, because they see certain needs, or they identify, as what you're saying, Victoria, with certain opportunities because of where their community is at now. And our communities are all at different levels of healing and readiness and physical location in terms of these opportunities. So I think it's working within what the community wants. Practically as a career development practitioner, or somebody who works in employment and training, or program delivery, or client coaching, when you're asked to work with these communities, I think it's getting an understanding of what's the community's direction, what's their interest. Maybe they've got their community action plan strategy, and they're looking for some help, or they are part of, in some of our communities, they're part of impact benefit agreements, so they have opportunities because there's development now in their traditional territories, so they're looking at distinct employment and distinct kind of economic business development. So as a career practitioner, we need to understand where that community, if you're going to work with a community, is at, ask some questions and see what's relevant to them, and use that, I think, practically as your starting point for conversation about what then is possible. Again, we can't go in and assume, what the community's ready for, where it has been, and where it wants to go. It's going in with asking the questions and letting the community lead you, and you use your toolbox as a facilitator, as a coach, as a practitioner, to help them walk the path on their own, because you can't walk it for them, but we have skills as practitioners to help others walk that path. And I think those are just some thoughts, because that's a really big question.
So this is another question, and I hope I don't blow this. Kia Ora from Aotearoa. Is that how I say that? Powerful questions and responses. Perhaps we have too few Indigenous career practitioners in our respective countries. In addition to this important sharing of Indigenous practice, how do panel members see our field can bring or attract more Indigenous practitioners to do this important work? I'm going to start with a question that is really easy. How many Indigenous practitioners do each of you know?
I was contemplating and thinking that again, it's a layered question. There are not many, from my experience, career practitioners within New Zealand that of Pacific descent. Is the question really around how do we attract Indigenous folk into this particular industry? Yeah.
I think the idea of career practice. I think there are a lot of Māori who do what we do amongst their whānau, in different types of roles, so I think there are a lot of conversations out there that are career type of conversations, and I think that perhaps when we talk about attracting people into our field, there are some barriers to what we would describe as our field. So if we call it career development, if we call it career guidance and education, those titles can sometimes be a barrier. Qualifications can sometimes be a barrier. So in answer to that question, I think we should encourage a broad range of career practices. We should be sharing knowledge as to how we do what we do, how iwi, tribal collectives, how they establish their career development plans, because I think we're all doing very similar work, but we're just calling it different things. Some of us are within professional associations, some of us are in networks. We don't have to. We can be different. We can be different. I guess that's my response to that kind of question. However, the critique here is that we know that there are some career practitioners within particular places, be it schools or professional associations, where the power resides, and we need to share that power out, share it, share our knowledge, share attending things like this. Yeah, and so my idea is that it is diverse, but it's who's considered part of that, who's considered a career practitioner, when there are a lot of people that do what we do.
Thanks, Lynette. Before,
oh,
I
sorry.
have one more question. I have
Okay.
one more question I want to get to. So I'm going to move to the next question. And Trina, I'm going to start with you because you earlier spoke to this. So in response to genealogy and blood memories, and I think that I'm doing this because I think this is really important. All good except for those who've not had connections to their ancestors or their blood family. How do you address this when working with people from a career development point of view? So for an Indigenous person who has had no connection, it's a totally, how do you?
Yeah, well, and you're right. I mean, I think it is that experience, the lived experience that individuals have had. We know in our country, there was, many children removed from homes and didn't go back and lost connection to their family. And so I think the reality is everyone has a story. You've lived through, and I think if I was talking with someone one-on-one, you've lived through different phases of your life, from when you remember when you were little, through adolescence to adulthood. And I guess in that specific sense, who you are today is a result of how you've overcome challenges through those times, how you've navigated and found solutions. So I think it's working with people to help them identify that they do have certain traits, certain instincts, ways of being that, regardless if they don't know where it came from, they have those things inside them. And it's through my work, my responsibility as a career practitioner is to just helping them unpack and connect to the good things. As I said earlier, sometimes we're here to just bring some hope and some possibility, and to reaffirm for that person that, what, when you followed that instinct and you made the right choice and it got you on a better path, reflect on that, remember that you have a story regardless of how you came to be here, and you're living out that story now. So I think this is a good question, and it is a question that people do struggle with, but I hope that provides some help. I mean, I think that's maybe how I would approach it.
Peter, Lynette?
Yeah, it really comes down to the question of having context when you're with that particular individual. It's layered again. I mean, I've used that word so many times. Independent on why that individual has obviously brought up the topic around genealogy, sense of identity. It's just opening, let them lead that conversation to where it goes with. I, like Trina, would just open up that conversation where it's led then by that particular person to understand it. And if the question is asked around genealogy, then whatever knowledge base that you have, you start to build something from that.
Yeah, I support that as well. Yeah, you know, when we talk about connection, no connection, you know, I wonder how that has come about, whether the person has said, I don't have any connections to, you know, whatever it is they're talking about. So we start with the connection between each other, the connection that we have, you know, as a career practitioner with a client, or Indigenous with an Indigenous client. We start with that connection and go from there.
That was very good. Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, I think Sorella is going to come in and close our off for us today. But I really appreciate your input and the way you've answered all those questions. Some of them were kind of tough.
And yeah, I'm back. It's time to conclude this webinar. And before sharing our survey and the additional learning opportunity that our participants can engage with at SAREC, I really want to take the time to warmly thank the four of you, Lynette, Peter, Trina, and Victoria, for having trust SAREC and CDENS, for being a safe place to come and share your perspective and insight on how both Indigenous and non-Indigenous career practitioners can work together, can build authentic relationship with client and Indigenous community in order at the end to promote inclusive and respectful career development practice. I heard so many inspiring answers today from all of you, but one thing that I will keep is that regardless of who we are, and our background, we cannot know everything. We need to be vulnerable, knowing that, and not knowing all the differences between communities. So the important thing is asking and being ready to adapt our programs, workshop, and approaches to each and every groups. And I like how you said it, Trina, to ask instead of tell. Really, like it was very inspiring. So thank you again for the four of you, sorry, for your participation. And I also want to say a special thanks to the Career Development Association of New Zealand, which supported us in this initiative from the very beginning and helped bring this amazing international perspective into this conversation. While we know that their team is incredibly busy organizing their upcoming conference scheduled for October 11 to 13, they have done really an amazing job by including a Maori, Pacific, and Indigenous session in each and every block. And I'm looking at you, Lynette. I know you will be presenting. So I will highly encourage all of you to visit their website and register. And of course, I want to thank all of you for embarking in this learning journey with us and for your great questions and engagement throughout this series. So I would like to invite you to stay a few more minutes to fill out our survey and share your feedback on the series and any other learning needs you may have. But before that, I want to quickly share a few other learning opportunities that you can engage with at SAREC. So You may know us for that, but CEREC will be hosting our national conference, Can Access, in a hybrid format in January of next year. And this format will allow you to attend regardless of where you are in the world. So hello, New Zealander colleagues. Our program will be released in the next few weeks and will include several amazing learning opportunities to continue the conversation on how to best learn, build relationships, and work with Indigenous community. These included our powerful Indigenous blanket exercise, an opportunity to hear from multiple presenters, including our keynote speaker, Sean Lessar. So you can learn more and register by visiting our website at canaccess.ca. And I will also encourage you to watch out for our first ever theme-based CareerWise weekly email to be sent tomorrow, with the first theme being indigenizing career development. And I know that, Victoria, you also share a very interesting point of view on this. So watch out for the email tomorrow. And additionally, you can see on your screen, you can find many other excellent webinars happening over the next few weeks, covering various topics such as unconscious bias in job search, how to support the integration of refugee, how to use a strengths-based approach, or the ACT metrics in career development, or how to launch and run your practice as an independent practitioner. So you can learn more and register at CEREC/webinars. With all that said, I will now open our quick survey for you to share your feedback of this series and let us know about your learning needs. So what I will do, I will keep the webinar open for the next 5-10 minutes for you to enter your comments, but I will now officially conclude by thanking you one more time, Lynette, Peter, Trina, and Victoria, and thanking you all for your great engagement throughout this series. I hope to see you at another learning opportunity very soon. So I will now open the survey. Thank you in advance for your comments.